Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Big Boys Table episode 28. We're going to be talking about a couple of different topics as we usually do, but one of the things that I'd like to discuss at least a little bit, at least for the opening section, is going to be about engagement in an RTS environment. We've talked about this before, so far be it from us to go over the greatest hits again and just regurgitate information you already know from watching the old podcasts, but I got some new things that I'd like to bring up with regards to this. So I guess we'll see where that leads us. That is so. So joining me as always.
Well, let's hear it then, Jiminy Cricket.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about ways to essentially escape the loop of producing what amounts to tech demos. And obviously when you're talking about making custom content, you're always or almost always going to be making tech demos. Like pretty much impossible to do anything other than that because most games are unfinished alphas or whatever. And so if you compare that to like odds are your custom content probably isn't going to be like what a released product should be. So, you know, it's kind of hazy. Odds are you're not going to be able to achieve that level. But just from a more conceptual standpoint, I guess, when you're trying to lay out the idea of escaping from that tech demo phase and actually ascending towards producing a finished product. Obviously, if it's a video game, it should be, well, I think if it's anything, but especially a video game, it should be engaging in an interactive sense, where the player themselves is responsible for responding to events and also creating things that the game is responsible for responding to that the player made. Is there anything so far that you think I'm got wrong in this analysis?
It's all pretty basic. It leads up to the point where you start to think about, so how do I engage a player, which is normally through making something that's difficult and usually involves some kind of learning experience or at least some kind of actual thinking. So in other words, basically the opposite of the average campaign for StarCraft.
Well, that was one of the other things that I wanted to talk about is something that recently I had to play was Life of a Marine. I don't know if you're very familiar with this, but basically
I am more familiar with the creator than
Gemini.
I am the campaign, unfortunately.
So, has Gemini actually made anything else? I haven't bothered to look at my list yet, but offhand, do you know?
I think a long time ago, he was thinking of making something, but he never did. He never got into it. World of Warcraft sucked him up instead.
Yeah, according to my list, he's only got 2 releases, at least on the first half of it. I haven't checked the other half, but I'm pretty sure anything that he would have made would have been back in like 2004-ish. Of course, he did make a campaign, a quote-unquote campaign in 2007 for the contest that Labyrinth held. And I'm not kidding. It took me less than 30 minutes to beat it, and one of which was just like a mission that he took from vanilla StarCraft. So it's none of it. At no point were you actually playing the game. You're just sort of like right-clicking and waiting for the dialogue to go away.
Laconia's had a lot to say about the other entries for that contest. I really wish I could remember, but it mostly involved a lot of him laughing.
It's funny that you say that because Laconius's campaign was, I would say, way worse than anything that I've played from like that contest. Like, obviously, it has more production value.
I remember it being just a string of point-and-click adventure maps.
Yeah,
I remember.
Well, there's only 3 maps, and I guess the ending was kind of rushed, or the last map was rushed in some sense. It opens up with a random non sequitur boss battle, and then the character that like you're using to like have the boss battle, just at the end he just shows up, or after the boss battle he just shows up to the rest of the characters. He's like, "Hi, I'm here now," and it's like, and then after that I'm not kidding, man. You basically get cannot create more united as like hordes of Zerg are spawned in, and you have to cross this giant bridge of death, and if you don't make it there within the first 10 minutes, you basically have to restart from that section again, because there's literally no way you can win, because across the bridge is some super unit that he kit bashed together, or I don't even know where he got it from, but it was some really disgusting looking unit. I don't know. If you saw it, you would know what I'm talking about. It's just sick.
Are you talking about the Protoss one?
Yeah, the giant fucking killer that was supposed to be like a Colossus or something. Yeah.
Unfortunately, you probably have me to blame for that. He basically told me that it was because of me badgering him about the key for that he completed it at all, and he would later say that was the only reason he ever got anything done. When it came to Vile Aggression 2 or whatever, he just couldn't find that spark to get going again, and he said it was because it wasn't the same environment as that was created, and I wasn't harassing him about it. So
So basically he was not self-motivated.
That editing actually came from HKS, the iScript.
Oh, okay.
So
that's weird. I would have guessed that. Like, he's surrounded by people who use iScripting, like you, and I guess HKS as well obviously has some familiarity with it. You'd think that he'd be able to just look at your guys' work and learn, but I guess not.
Yeah. No, did I ever tell you about the story about how Laconius had an explosion off the internet?
Well, he's had multiple, as far as I know, but why don't you retread it here, since we're already on this topic? I don't remember if you've told it on the podcast.
Well, there was
before.
one time. He allegedly became a born again Christian. I'm not entirely sure if he was trolling me at the point or not, but apparently he had some secret texts and hideaway, and he became Christian or something. That didn't last very long.
Okay.
And then he wanted to create a YouTube channel about game reviews. Well, rather, it was Wybod's suggestion. And Wybod was the only one really putting in the effort to actually try to attempt this, because Laconius needed money. And but Laconius didn't want to try to figure out how to work OBS. Now, OBS is a finicky piece of software, but using it is really just as simple as pushing record and going. But some weeks of him being unable to figure that out led to HKS making fun of him. And along the same time, he was talking to me about his financial situation, and it came up that his mother allegedly owns or manages some not insignificant part of some phone company. And I said, well, why don't you ask her for a job? Because she can probably get you a job opening, even if it's just like scrubbing dead dogs out of underneath toilet seats or something like that. And he was like, no, I can't ask my mom for help and other shit. And then he blocked everybody and ran away, and apparently got deported back to Korea and is teaching English now, which is something I had suggested that he could do, is teach English. But apparently he took that advice to heart, deported himself back to Korea, and hasn't been heard from since, except for he messaged Wybod once, and he messaged maybe Labyrinth once. And and then he messaged Schwa too. So, but that was well after the fact. So a lot of this actually comes from a result of his repeated attempts to get into Blizzard. So I may have mentioned this in the past, but
I remember
he was very, very desperate to get into Blizzard. Very, very desperate to get into Blizzard. He thought he could suck up to Blizzard enough that they would actually hire him. When their actual hiring process, there is no standards for getting into Blizzard. You basically can just be dick fuck nobody. But it really helps to actually meet a recruiter, which means actually being in a college campus. In the case of the other individual I know who is actually in Blizzard, is now considered a senior game designer despite having never actually designed a game before. And but Laconius obviously didn't, as far as I know, live in that area. But so he had Labyrinth put him together a cinematic map, which he then did a voiceover for, and then that didn't get him anything. So I think that was one of a myriad of attempts, at least I know of, that sent him into a catastrophic existential crisis that he couldn't become the next Dustin Browder, a literally who at the helm of Blizzard Entertainment. And well, as far as I know, now he's just one of those innumerable people who have undergone reconstructive surgery to transfer their gender in Korea or Taiwan, as they're well known for, as the Trap Brigade, and is now servicing the strait for foreigner tourists. So that's probably what he's doing now, I assume.
Well, they have a whole industry of that over there.
It's kind of a far cry from when he was trying to make maps for that contest, and how
the silly have fallen, huh? I mean, it's not really that different than what you would be doing at Blizzard, I guess. So, I mean, in that case, he's just working for a different company. But
he was really into that Metathrom thing, but he was always making fun of Metathrom.
Really? Because Metathrom beta tested and has credits and Vile Aggression, so that's pretty funny.
Yeah. And he made fun of basically every single person who ever posted on that forum. He's also the most racist person I'd ever met. By far. Like, actually legitimately racist. Not like, I make fun of people because it's topical, but like actually legitimately racist. So it was really, really funny when that even got like tongue-in-cheek spun on him, how butthurt he quickly became.
Well, out of curiosity, on a personal level, does that cutscene map that Labyrinth put together from him feature Ulrazaj, a Dark Archon, and some stupid Cerebrit.
It was in StarCraft 2.
Yes, I'm aware. I know
It's
of a cutscene
possible.
that has those features.
A
that
very
I just
large
mentioned.
chunk of the dialogue involves him auto-filleting Blizzard.
Yeah, well, that's what I was wondering. Is like I don't like he didn't actually use any Blizzard characters besides Artanis to deliver like 2 lines with Legion sounding like a fucking complete old guy, just like pitch shifted out of nowhere. Nothing like the actual Artanis, but
That's
whatever.
That's most of his shit.
I can't wait to play some of that guy's
He can do
campaigns.
the one voice. He can do a Lich voice from Warcraft 3 very, very well, almost 1-to-1, and that's the one voice he can do.
Yeah, it's funny. You do get some people who are like specialists at a particular voice, and as long as they can do that voice, they can be like voice actors in one project, or they can do that line in their own projects. But then you get people who are like that, but also try to do everything else, which is basically what Laconius is. I don't know what his one voice would be, but the voices that I've heard.
Lich voice.
Well, for Laconius, I mean.
He couldn't.
Or are you talking about Legion?
I'm talking about Laconius.
Oh, okay. Laconius good. Okay.
Legion, I don't know about his voice acting, but his editing wasn't very impressive. So, but Laconius could only do the one voice, the Lich voice, which he could do pretty well, but that was it. And I tried for years and years and years to help him try to like branch out and kind of at least give him pointers on how to like explore, especially like expressive voice acting. And he couldn't explore it. And to be honest, it was like one of the most hardest, like, this was definitely the most difficult time I had as a tutor trying to teach somebody because I couldn't actually really understand what his problem was. Right. And I trained a lot of people from basically never having picked up a microphone before and to becoming fairly decent voice actors within like a couple months. But for him, it was much more difficult. Maybe it was because of the ESL thing, but apparently his Korean wasn't very good either to begin with. So I don't really know, but it didn't really work out for him, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he seems like a bit of a lost character. The reason why I was asking about that map, the cinematic map, is that because that is precisely what I had seen linked in some form or another where, and it was like a video that was uploaded, I don't know when, 2010 or something.
Yeah, it was on YouTube, yeah.
Yeah, and so he had linked this to me, but when we were talking in like 2012 or 2013, like this was old,
it was a long
like
time
years old when he had sent it to me. Maybe I'm getting the exact timeline wrong, but I was like
pretty old.
Asking him what he had been up to recently, and that's what he sent. So I guess he just never did anything else after that. I don't know.
Labyrinth put that whole thing together, so he wasn't really up to anything still.
Yeah, even back then he wasn't up to anything.
He took credit for the whole thing, but it wasn't his work.
Gotta love it. So I guess at that point, the only thing that the reason why I bring up anything related to Life of a Marine is because that stuff is, the quintessential micro bullshit that, for whatever reason, took off back in like the mid 2000s or early 2000s. And I guess it has always been there because you look at Legacy of the Confederation back in '99, but we already sort of touched on that in the previous podcast. But I was bringing that up because I don't remember when, it was probably during the Antioch 3 run, mentioned that the bare minimum for even a casual player to be engaged, especially in an RTS context, is to hit like 100 APM. But this is true even in like a micro sense, or even in a shooter, probably. Like as long as you're like, if you're getting to the point,
it's even more true in that sense,
right? Yeah.
Because in a micro map, you're spending so long just staring at fucking nothing.
Right. Well, that's the thing is, so the reason why I bring this up is because right now, amongst other things, I'm working on a system that would basically port MOBA mechanics to the Brood War engine, so that a player in a macro environment where there's macro human players and macro computer players could also play as a micro player controlling just one unit, and then maybe summons or something additional, and then they would be able to move around the map, and I would solve like the fact that there's a large scale map and they have one unit. Like obviously you don't want to be having them wait for units to get from point A to point B, because that's basically all these other micro maps. But I've got some stuff in place to solve some of those issues with a sort of a fast travel system. But this is a particular like worthy topic for me, an important topic for me to sort of mine the people in the comments, but obviously also yourself, as how you would go about doing something like that. Basically, the only thing that I could think of, or the first thing that came to my mind, is having a system where you are essentially using this one hero, but just like in MOBAs, you can actually rack up 100 plus APM as like a bare minimum in order to play well in a micro sense. And so obviously it's a lot of work. You need to enhance the engine and figure out what else you need to add in. There's going to be a lot of reverse engineering, a lot of ASM stuff required, and thankfully I got a guy helping me out with that. But generally speaking, I suppose a better question for you, a more pointed question, would be, is this something you've ever tried yourself in a RTS engine?
It actually is. I tried it, and then I immediately backburned it because it was not possible. Back with StarCraft 2, actually. So this is actually Armageddon Onslaught 2. So Armageddon Onslaught 1 was obviously just a tech demo, but it was functionally a survival game type, 1 Armageddon versus 7 computers. So come into StarCraft 2, you can't have mods. So that whole thing, like I had built a lot of concepts for that and written out a lot of stuff. There was obviously some unit concepts and stuff posted on CC a while ago. That was then, scrapped. But there was a lot of like game archetype concepts and stuff as well. So then obviously StarCraft 2 hit. It discovered you can't have mods. Blizzard went out of their way to disable mods like Zelnique's Manly sound pack and stuff like that. And CRC and hot loading, disabling and stuff like that. So Armageddon Onslaught was just instantly rendered impossible. So I was like, okay, well, now I can make a campaign instead. So building it as a build and destroy really was not going to be feasible either because the performance of StarCraft 2 is so bad. And so that came to the ARPG concepts, some of the demonstrational videos of which garnered a lot of traffic because they were some of the earliest prototypes of this kind of stuff on StarCraft 2. I was using the one of the first prototype FPS engines that was built for that game to test it. So the whole theory is that it would be something similar to what you describe as a MOBA, but it wasn't a MOBA. It was a exploration of a existing concept that I had placed in Warcraft 3. So one of my early Warcraft 3 campaigns, Eternity 3, was you play as a hero in an RTS environment. You have RTS allies and RTS enemies, sometimes multiple enemies who are hostile to each other, and you have to defeat them or fulfill some specific objective or something like that. So this was something I had explored a lot for a long time, all the way back since like 2004 with Warcraft 3, just always because of performance. It was always performance that drove me in this direction because I needed ways to govern the map scale in a way that wasn't a complete clusterfuck. Also, Warcraft 3 was basically horrible to play from an RTS viewpoint because of the pathing and stuff like that. And eventually, this is what drove me to abandon that entirely. Plus the AI that can't navigate cliffs and other basic dumbass shit. So enter StarCraft 2, the performance wasn't going to happen. But the concept was there. Unfortunately, third-person maps don't work in StarCraft 2 at all. The engine just doesn't support it. The performance is bad. The controls are bad. And to get just basic aiming and stuff to work was not going to happen either. So that concept, the written edition, was ported actually to be an Unreal concept as well, which is what initially got me into porting character assets into Unreal until I realized unless I'm an animator, I can't do it. So the whole thing was dropped. But yes, as an idea, I explored that a lot on the written level, a little bit on the actual concept level. And it was actually I think it's very different than what you were trying to do because you're still trying to make something more or less at an RTS viewpoint. All of my directions within StarCraft 2 and beyond, after Warcraft 3, were designed to be built from a third-person perspective as opposed to a top-down. And but there was a lot of emphasis on precision and speed. But also summons and stuff like that were a really big thing. So there was multiple different kinds of characters you would play through this. I can talk about some of the archetypes if you want for some of the gameplay concepts for them. One of them was built mostly on summons, using placing objects and stuff and summoning things and letting them do the fighting for you and being very careful about your positioning. Whereas another one was much more, you could think like DMC kind of melee combat and stuff like that. Ranged was going to be a shit show in StarCraft 2. It's one of the reasons why it got dropped is because shooting stuff out of the air, especially when air is just fucked in StarCraft in general, just wasn't going to happen. And yeah, the AI and stuff like that was being very finicky. But I also, because this was introducing a hybrid where you had AI allies and stuff like that, I wanted to have a mechanism by which you could direct what your AI allies actually do. So it'd be sort of an exploration of the beacon system that Blizzard eventually shoehorned into the game that is incredibly performance intensive. But it would be much more simpler. I'd just say, build this, build that, attack here, attack that. And the AI would just sort of automate things in a much more simple and streamlined manner. But one of the maps, for example, The first map as Asmodeus in the original Armageddon Onslaught 2 concept, you started off without any allies at all, and it was a map with 9 enemy bases or something like that. And you basically had a leeway to choose which base you could attack and destroy, at least within like the beginning area. And then that's where your allies would first summon. And then you would pick and choose who you attack depending on the terrain and what you tell your allies to do. So there's a variety of different ways you could explore that map, all of which would have actually been very easy to set up once you actually had the ARPG framework in the game. The AI system and stuff like that was very easy to implement at this point. Obviously, the ARPG framework didn't exist, so it wasn't going to happen. But yeah, it was an idea I toyed a lot with. That if I was to make an Unreal game, like if I was to make something like a DMC, that is still the kind of framework I would do to this day. I call it the living world concept. Because when I look at all these ARPGs and stuff like that, I always try to think of how would I manage the game world. Because in all of these games, whether it's just a custom map with like Life of Marine or whatever, or something like God of War or DMC, everything is static. Nothing ever moves. Nothing ever does anything besides just standing there and then having some reaction for the player walking in. All the arenas are all forced. It's basically a glorified quick time event. So I always thought of ways in which I could have the game world be alive around the player so stuff happens around you. And probably the most complicated concept to come out of that was the Unreal game concept, where I had maps where it was basically defend the objective. But the objective was a king of the hill in which there was your AI allies running around, which were also heroes. There were enemies who would actually board this station on different ships and different Z levels. There's like 3 or 4 different Z levels and stuff like that. And then, building of structures and everything you sort of like expect out of like an RTS. But at no point within this do you actually play an RTS. It's still just basically Devil May Cry or God of War. But the framework has always been thought of from an RTS first viewpoint, because if you think of an RTS, you think of resource management, you think of economy, you think of map control and environment. I was thinking of how can I put that into an existing ARPG framework to make the world actually feel alive. So it's not just you going from sectioned off point to sectioned off point in a linear point and click, fight cinematic, fight cinematic, fight cinematic, all this boring, predictable gibberish with, shoehorned in puzzles and other garbage just tossed in just to waste your fucking time so you can't refund on Steam. It is definitely been the living world concept is actually probably like the most heavily revised of my game concepts for a really long time, because it's something I definitely would like to explore with, but I don't have a framework to do it with.
Yeah, so one of the more interesting aspects about what you brought up about the living world thing is the fact that it's so rare to actually see. I've played a myriad of titles that claim to be RPGs or claim to have some really like immersive world or whatever the fuck, and really it's like very shallow. I don't know if it's just because I have experience designing stuff that, I mean, you can't really call it game design, but like world design, world building, figuring out like what makes sense for an enemy opponent to do in this environment. And but it never really feels like there's anything even close to a living world where all you get is like maybe some units patrol around certain areas, or they spawn in and go to a certain area, but they never feel like they have goals. They're the presence or the reason why they're there is pretty much just to impede you, or to serve as like, well, you're playing an RPG, so of course there's got to be combat, and like obviously there does have to be combat, but you'd think you'd justify the encounter across multiple different things, right? The same way you would want a single line of dialogue to serve multiple purposes if you could, because that's like efficient usage of that real estate. You would want an encounter with an enemy to be like reinforcing the goal of that faction and reinforcing the fact that like characterization of this enemy unit that you're fighting, and the personality that they have, and reinforcing the idea that they're here for a reason in this area of the space station or the world or wherever you're in, and all this other stuff. Like in addition to providing a challenge for the player, which most of them are never really challenging, but that would be ostensibly what they're there for. You'd think that you'd want to do a bunch of these other elements so that there's more of a meaningful, more of a reason to be there in the first place. And of course, that never happens in practice.
It never happens.
So
have you seen my Viking Battle for Asgard run?
Yeah, I saw it way back in the day.
That is the closest an ARPG has ever gotten to what you're describing. And it's not very close. To the point where you have to QTE everything because your allies won't even engage them. All the pathing and stuff is based on your positions. Enemies just run baked animations as opposed to actually fighting each other and stuff like that. And that's the closest by far any third-person game that I know of, besides like Unreal Tournament, which isn't even remotely the same scale, has gotten to having anything remotely resembling a living world. Because nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to try to do it. And none of the people who play those games are into that kind of thing. Let's look at it this way. God of War 4 introduced leveling up and crafting. Yeah. And that was considered an expansion of God of War's ideas, which already were to basically remove all the gameplay from Devil May Cry and replace it with quick time events. People are hailing these games, which are literal fucking flaming trash heaps, diverging away from action games and from skill-based gameplay further and further and further the more and more and more they travel away.
Well, the thing is, like, obviously the user base or whatever isn't going to be the reason why the content gets made or whatever, because like clearly they're willing to settle for pretty much anything, and that's its own a different argument. But on the basis of actually trying to design something that you as a developer find like competent, I feel like Living World is a good place to start, because even though it seems like more of an atmospheric element or a story-based element, like narratively or whatever, like it makes sense for these characters or these factions or whoever's in, it could just be a rabid beast or something. Like it makes sense for them to have an agenda and try to do certain things and give them like a task list, and that makes sense from an immersive standpoint. But what you'll find, the more you get into that and the deeper you go into trying to figure out what exactly that means, is you'll see very quickly actually that in order to actually do that well, in order to do that concept justice, you have to make them challenge the player. And you have to make them engage the player directly, almost always, or at least engage some other faction in the world, because that's the only way that they can personify a beast that's looking to get some food. Obviously, that means it's got to attack something, or a faction that's looking to claim some territory. That means they've got to take it from somebody else. So obviously there'd be conflict that just happens emergently, and just by taking this approach to trying to design a living world, you would naturally get to that point. And I guess as a more specific example, there was an RPG type map I was planning some time ago as one of the potential projects that I'd be working on for one of my brother's birthday stuff. I always make him some sort of map every year, if not multiple. And one of the ideas that I had was to go into Warcraft 3. And that was, of course, my first mistake. But after I got past that, I was going to try to make it so that we would be playing an RPG, and it'd just be sort of like a MOBA in terms of like the mechanics that you'd be having and the viewport and stuff like that. I wasn't going to mess with the camera angle. And I don't know exactly what the final skills would have been for the heroes. I didn't get too far into planning that stuff. But very early on, I realized I wanted, a faction here and a faction there, and having, them push out from their territory and really try to find additional ground. And so you could clear an entire area, that like a camp or a forward base or something like that, and if you leave them alone for long enough, you'd come back and they'd be setting it back up again, or they would have it maybe even fortified more because it was already taken out and they want to hold on to it this time. Or if you weakened them enough, maybe the other faction would roll in and take that area. So the idea would be, like you described something as King of the Hill earlier, and the idea would be it's almost like that but for everybody. Like everybody's trying to claim these territories, and there's going to be a land grab, and some are going to be more well funded than others. Maybe if the player literally does nothing and just observes this battlefield, the battle would play out and end with one faction having supremacy over everybody else. And, that would probably include killing the player in that case. But the idea being that if the player wasn't interacting with something, this would still be a world where there was conflict, a world where there was things happening, a world where there were actions. And if you get a sense of that as a player, I feel like that immediately increases the scale in your mind of what this universe actually has to offer. Because it's literally saying, even if I wasn't here, there'd be stuff going on. So of course I want to experience some of that stuff. Like that's an interesting premise, is shit would be happening even if it wasn't for me. And so I can walk into a battle going on between multiple factions, not even know either of them were there before I walked in. And then, suddenly I see two factions fighting. Or suddenly I see an enemy expanding to a new area in an RTS map or something like that. And the more I talk about this, the more I realize I've essentially already created that sort of living world archetype, at least in some form or another, with my RTS missions, because all of my factions, and I almost always try to go for some sort of free-for-all or another, but even in just flat-out, 2v2 or 3v3 or whatever, you'll see all of these factions attacking, expanding, having some infighting and skirmishes, and eventually, one of them will reign supreme just because one of them got more expansions, or one of them got a bigger army, or one of them attacked here a certain way. And so you can almost see those storylines, sort of telling themselves, unfolding in front of you just by observing the way that the AI work. And I guess the reason why, one of those things that I guess I get lost in a lot is I'm always wondering, like, I'm always harping on, like, the shortcomings of whatever I'm working on. And yet there are people out there who look at the stuff that I've made. I think you've said something similar about, like, people who were offering to just buy StarCraft 2 just so that they could play your content because of the way what you were describing. And, like, the people who are watching the maps being made and they play it for a while, they're like, wow, this is great. And I'm like, thinking to myself, like, I could see so many issues, like it's still in beta phase or whatever, like it's not done, and it's going to be not done for a while. We're still, like, fixing certain aspects of it, but people are still pretty psyched about it. Like, it must be that there's literally no content like this anywhere else, because otherwise they just go play that stuff instead of mine, like half-finished shit, you know what I mean? So I guess it's just, there is a small audience for that knows where to get it, but it's just really bizarre to me that, it's been so long and we still haven't really seen an RTS that has that living world concept the way that you and I have been describing so far in this podcast.
There's a lot of people that are waiting and hoping that I actually work on Apex J and get it functional, use some kind of prototype for it. There's people who've been waiting a long time, since before StarCraft 2 even came out, because they know that that's the kind of stuff I make. And yeah,
it's one of the only places to get it, right? So
yeah, it's sad. It's honestly really, really sad,
because like, I don't think of myself as some fucking big brain motherfucker incel guy who's just, like, sitting here really studying up on game design practices and coming up with these, like, novel ways of looking at game design.
Shit.
Like, it does feel like I'm just working on basic principles. Maybe the execution's a little muddied and advanced because I'm working with a game that's not open source, and I've got to fucking get some Russian guy to go in and just deprogram the entire game and on his Nokia or something. But, like, whatever the fuck happens, like, he's doing that, and I really am grateful. But you look away from that, like, outside of some of the execution stuff being stupid, and maybe, like, some other map makers or modders or whatever, they want to learn how I'm doing some of this stuff, it really isn't that complicated. Like, the actual execution on a technical side might be a little bit something that might glaze people's eyes over a little bit, but when it comes to the actual conceptual stuff, like, you could just look at that as you're playing it, or as you're watching a video of somebody else playing it, and you can see it's really, like, basic shit. Like, yeah, of course this AI is going to expand, because the player would expand in that case, and the AI is on the same, like, running by the same rules as the player, besides some like, income percentage cheats because they don't handle their units as well as I would like them to. And obviously in an ideal world that wouldn't be an issue either, and maybe, given enough time, we might be able to reverse engineer enough shit to give the AI actual micro and strategic stuff. But even outside of that, like, just the fact that, like, people are just, like, they can't even conceive of what I'm talking about half the time. Like, again, I don't think that I'm, like, intellectually superior to anybody who I've talked to about this stuff, yet they always seem like this is the first time anybody's ever mentioned it to them, or this is the first time anybody's even, like, maybe they thought about it fleetingly, but they never thought, like, for a second, oh yeah, this is something that can happen, or somebody's actually going to make this. Like, it really isn't that difficult to do. It requires some research and some practice to get the technical stuff down, but after that,
and that's a terrifying precedent.
Yeah, like, the fact that I'm doing this in, obviously not to devalue anybody's contribution to this stuff, but the fact that I'm one of the few people doing this stuff, and people are, like, in disbelief that it can be done at all. Like, what the fuck is happening?
I'm gonna grab coffee really quick, and I'll be back in a moment.
Well, enjoy this intermission, boys. Just kidding. I'm not re-rendering this because of an intermission, so you're just gonna have to listen to me babble. We'll wait for Mesk to return from his coffee trip. And I know that we talked a little bit about Laconius for longer than maybe we expected. Sort of derailed a little bit there, but that's fine. That's what you expect to some degree. And we will be returning to the central topic of the episode in a little bit. And probably, I don't imagine this will be a very long episode, although of course you already know that because you clicked on the video. But yeah, I have a feeling we'll get to the nut of things around an hour and a half and we'll be able to close up. So we'll see what happens. Thanks for joining us, as always. Now, one thing I really want to know is, who the fuck told Laconius it was a good idea to make micro? He seems to be very receptive of other people's ideas, but apparently nobody said, hey, maybe you should make some RTS stuff. Man.
It's ridiculous.
Uh-oh.
Because how many of these people came in to play StarCraft because you can click on rain or click around a map at 1 p.m. I don't think anyone did it for that reason.
No, I hope not.
But then that's the content they end up making.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that baffles me. Like, Antioch 3.
3.
There wasn't a single actual RTS map in that entire anything. And, like, I'm trying to think of, like, why? Why didn't the designers want to make an RTS map? As far as I know, as far as I saw, not a single person in that entire group of people even actually played the game. So, like,
no,
why
just
don't
watch
they...
Gabriel play it, dude.
But I think it's arguable if he played it either. I mean, he just kind of, like, sleeps through everything, doesn't he?
Well, he actually did marathon Legacy of the Void when it came out, and it was like a 24-hour like he was up for a long time. So yeah, by the end he was definitely sleeping. He just wanted to get the videos out as quickly as possible for some psychotic
Why would
reason.
you put yourself through Legacy of the Void?
Hey, I suffered through it twice.
That poor boy. Well, I think you're just a masochist and have come to love CBT.
Did I ever tell you about
from
the story
what it
that
sounds
Patrick
like, anyways,
sent?
from all the campaigns you're playing.
Oh yeah, that was the other thing. Is have you ever looked forward to just walking into a steaming pile of shit? Because I am kind of, in a sick, twisted way, I am kind of really looking forward to playing Wonders of Sorceria. Just like, I don't know if that's just me. Like, the wires are crossing. I'm not actually going to enjoy myself.
I hope you're voice acting every single piece of dialogue.
Oh yeah, well of course. I listen. I'm not going to just sit there and let that go by. I have to read this stuff.
Voice act
I've been voice acting every single line of unvoiced dialogue in every project I've played since like 2017, and man, has it done a fucking number on me.
I've voice hacked everything in Guild Wars, and that there is a lot.
Yeah,
but and World of Warcraft too.
Yeah, well, that just makes you start getting angry because cliff giants hang around cliffs.
That makes me go and have a chip out.
Yeah.
So, but
yeah, we were discussing why people make stupid shit that doesn't have anything to do with the original stuff, and we were using Antioch and other shit.
Because like the way you were saying before about how people like they come in here just all googly eyed, like, wow, people actually, that's the same kind of response I got too.
Yeah.
Is people asking, why doesn't anybody else do this? Why is this the first time that anybody has ever actually talked about making an RTS? And that's weird. Like, and again, back to Antioch 3, but also like say like even Dwarven Combat, although the subject never came up for that because it was just me helping him out with 3ds Max and stuff. But I look at these people who put in all this effort to like make these UI elements and all that shit, and they go through the trials of the editor just like anybody else does. They force themselves through that shit. They eat the diarrhea. They flamethrower the dogs. They build bricks out of shit and then build their igloo out of it, and then they call it a finished project. But the finished project, literally, like, it doesn't at the conceptual level target a single person who actually bought StarCraft. It doesn't, and I can be assured that at least at some level, when these individuals themselves purchased the game or pirated the game or whatever they did when they entered this arena, it was because they wanted to play that mythological beast known as the real-time strategy. So how did we go from that to now, where no content being produced is for real-time strategy? It's not for any strategy, and it's not even real-time. Pretty much all these fucking micro clicker hero maps are just glorified QTEs. They're just turn-based QTEs, just like World of Warcraft. Except they're even dumber than World of Warcraft, because not a single one of these people, not a single one that I've ever seen, has built a micro map with the intention of promoting micro. Like I said in the last podcast, in order to make an actually good micro map, you're going to have to rip out, like say for StarCraft 2, you have to rip out the Heroes of the Storm framework with the smart casting and skill shots and everything. You have to make about accuracy and execution. And this goes back to what you said when we started. You need to have, at least at the casual level, 100 APM. The average casual player for something like League of Legends or whatever that at least is into the game at the casual level is going to be around 100 APM or higher. And a lot of that's going to amount to spam, but as long as there's stuff going on, like constantly trading with your opponents, constantly dealing with jungling or jungling yourself, dealing with counter jungling, fighting, whatever you're doing, as long as there's always something going on, your APM is always going to be consistently high. But that's also a game with cooldowns. And the cooldowns are enormous. So that's inhibiting your APM. What we would do in a single player environment is we would remove things like cooldowns. We wouldn't need those anymore. We would probably double down on some specific kind of resource management, but we would stay away from things like builders and spenders because they're toxic. So what we could enter some other kind of skill expression through designing an actual resource system and getting away from all the pitfalls companies like Blizzard and Riot have gotten into. I should say Blizzard 2 because that's what Riot is. And then
Blizzard
you have
3.
a framework for building a system which you then turn around and look at our AI and be like, okay, so how does the opponents engage us in this? Because we want to have the opponents have engagement like the players as well, because the opponents make the game. But the micromaps don't have that either. None of these campaigns have that. They don't even make the slightest shred of an effort to actually get into the prospect of having micro. Instead, they try to dilute and distract with quote-unquote puzzles. Antioch Chronicles 3, again, the puzzle maps. Technically, the interface, very interesting. Didn't think you would be able to get away with it in StarCraft 2 as fluidly as you did. But hey, you did. But it's not content. It's not gameplay. It's not StarCraft. It doesn't belong. Maybe you could put it on a cell phone and show it off to a Chinese company and be like, hey, I know how to do stuff. And maybe they'll have you flipping burgers for a while and then you get your job. But in a campaign for an RTS is the last thing I'd ever expect to see. But that's what you see everywhere, back and forth, everywhere. Back down to, again, last podcast, you're talking about this fucking elevator or whatever the fuck.
Oh, yeah. Did I even really properly explain the elevator to you? I probably just needs a video demonstration. At some point, I'll have to send it over to you. But
why?
Yeah.
But why? My question is why?
It's just an avenue for fan fiction. It's just so that they can tell their story. Oh, yeah, there's a ruined elevator.
But they don't have a story. None of these people have ever even tried to make a story before.
I agree, but these people obviously had a different idea. They thought they were telling a great story. That's why they did it. There's no other way that makes any sense. These people are literally just, intercepting any gameplay they could have, changing everything constantly because the story demands it. The script demands it. Now this character where you were fighting this boss in fucking flame knives, well, now he has a new move, and it completely changes the way that you engage with them. So there's not even any fucking consistency to your stupid puzzle minigame idiot moron. So, what the fuck do you do in that case? You don't do anything. You just learn your new thing and then abandon it immediately. In one ear and out the other.
I mean, you're making something based off of Blizzard's ripoff of Warhammer. You couldn't have a story no matter how good you are at actually writing stories, because your framework just is this pile of horseshit with no consistency and not even the basic semblance of logic applied to it. How could you ever even hope of telling a story in it?
No, your best bet in that case is just to take your, really tell a good, character-driven story or something where the characters are the focal point of any development, and then also just make as much as possible, make your shit internally consistent, throw out anything that would make it externally consistent at the price of that, and just be like, yeah, whatever, this might not be how Protoss act in, the vanilla campaign, or this might not be how Zerg act, this might not be the technical explanation for how this works, but, it needs to be like this for my story to make sense, internally. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Rewrite whatever, don't fucking put it on a pedestal like these Mongoloids did. Don't try to one-up them or make something better than them, because that's assuming that this is any good to begin with. Just try to make your own shit within this weird confine, and then that's assuming you even want to work within that framework at all. It's easier to just jump in there, I guess, because people are
it done well.
With it. Well, when I have my IskatuMesk campaign finished, we can take a look at that. I feel like at the very least, the characters are significantly better than anything you'll see in Blizzard. Those are the defining elements of the whole thing.
That's not hard. That's not a high bar to exceed.
I 100% agree. So I'll let that campaign do the talking for us, because eventually we'll produce a whole video series on that if you're down to do that, because you said you were interested in co-casting it.
Yeah.
So
it'll be
see what happens.
interesting to see what you come up with after all this time, because you have made the very daring decision to stay within the original Blizzard setting, which is not something I've ever seen anybody even remotely come close to pulling off successfully, because when you're starting with something as fucked as this source, you got a lot of rewriting ahead of you. Like when I was looking at cannibalizing the races, I basically looked at everything other than the names and just Control A delete and rewrote everything from scratch. Because, for example, like right off the bat, you can't justify in-game behaviors with out-of-game behaviors. So that's something you have to deal with at the forefront, which is the basis of my rewrite was to make in-game stuff make sense. Like the fact you're just pissing out battle cruisers and marines that have butt-fuck nothing with nothing besides minerals. So I built an entire tech document based on nanofabrication and modular networks and subspace communications and electronic warfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The basis for Apex J's original writing and what has you fighting planet side as opposed to space side is because penetrating planetary shields and attacking underground generators and this other kind of stuff. And the reasons why you have limited tech trees is because, the network got bombed and all the databases got blown up in a sabotage. So now you have limited computational abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I always looked at it like, how can I justify what is happening in-game and make it consistent with what is happening out of game during cinematics or dialogue or the history or the setting or whatever. Because I believe in StarCraft 2's original writing, there's only supposed to be a couple dozen battlecruisers within possession of the Dominion or something like that.
It's like max 100, and then a book retconned it to max 50, so good luck.
Yeah, so the books are just cancer all on their own because they basically handed some random hacks a template book and said, right around this. And
yeah, well, it's really funny about the battlecruiser thing in particular because there's a cutscene in the Orbit of Char where 10 battlecruisers get shot down. It's like, oh yeah, well, half of the Dominion Armada is now dead. Okay, you can't just write half of that up. What the fuck? It completely recontextualizes shit that you already thought was silly enough, but at least made sense with the scale that you would presume is happening in a fucking RTS environment.
50 battlecruisers. Oh, by the way, we just populated this planet that used to be a nuclear wasteland and covered the entire thing in city lights within a couple years.
Yeah. And on top, there's a disconnect right there. Vermilion also
you can't believe this world. There's nothing believable. They don't even try at the superficial surface level to make their world believable. So how could you possibly tell a story in that? You can't.
Well, the way that you went for a very in the weeds, making sure that you were getting as dirty as you need to do in the details. Whereas I was a bit more minimalist with it, where I basically was just what's the term? I didn't really go into try to heavily rewrite everything. It was more it's sort of nebulous in this case because the specifics of the races and factions, they matter in a sense where if you're really going to analyze every single granular aspect of the campaign story, what you see on screen, maybe some shit from the original lore isn't going to make sense. For sure, that will probably end up happening. But as far as what really matters in the narrative, the characters themselves are where you'll see a lot of growth and a lot of depth. And at this point, it's sort of using StarCraft as a vehicle for these characters to get the development that they need in order to be as interesting as they wind up being. And of course I had central themes going in the story as well. I would say that considering the campaign is so primordial from a technical and execution based gameplay setup, where I was the first campaign I ever messed around with AI scripts and we had no engine manipulation. We barely had any custom mechanics that was just to make the heroes a little bit more exciting. But this is still back when I was using heroes and then defeating the player if they lost a single unit. It's obviously there's a lot of conceptual stuff that's just not useful at all, which is one of the reasons why I want to wait until the new version is out so that you can see essentially where that led to. But as a result of all of these gameplay things being so out of whack, I would say the most impressive thing about it is the fact that the characters are able to have a coherent sort of development, and they go through an arc, and they have things that make you actually give a shit about what they do, which is more than you could say about literally anything else. And maybe it's because Blizzard presented in such a stupid fashion the particulars of the races and the technical details of the universe that people get hung up on that without even really paying attention to the characters. So I sort of essentially
because Blizzard has never made an interesting character.
Right. Well, on top of that, I feel like the characters are interesting enough in my projects to sort of, I don't know if it's not meant to be a distraction. They are meant to be a focal point of the development of the project. It's something I think about a lot, and how the characters interact with each other and all this other stuff. And the dialogue goes through many, many drafts. But perhaps sort of a side effect of focusing on that is the fact that I don't really give a shit about rewriting the story particulars like the world building. I care more about like how I'm making sure that what I'm presenting is internally consistent with itself, and not really giving a shit if it's externally consistent with the lore. And that's where I think there's obviously a difference in our sort of approaches to that. But the end result is still, the end result is having a more like a universe you can take seriously with characters that carry you through that universe and give you a nice little like outlook, giving you a nice viewport into this universe, and helps to, even if you don't give a shit about like, wow, I'm curious about this race or how this race works or how this faction works, you might not be that curious about that, but you are going to be invested in where these characters go. And that's sort of like, just as good, if not better, in my particular, like where I come from. If story has better, like really, really good characters, like, I guess I would liken it to something like if you did an alternate history take on like World War II or something, and then you make Hitler a really, really compelling character. Like, if Hitler's such a good character that I don't give a shit about maybe what you, like, your alt history stuff was so crazy. You're thinking like a war
drama, kind of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, like, it doesn't make sense to tell a story or focus on characters that aren't in the middle of wartime. So I don't really know what I would do in an aftermath. Like, the end of a character's arc, if they're still alive by the end of this, which is kind of unlikely. Just like every character that I've seen, like I've envisioned a perfect death sequence, if that makes any sense. So like I know in my head where they're going to end up, and it's not pretty. So like if they've, against all odds in reality and also in their universe, managed to survive, them not being in battle would be the end of their arc, because I've got nowhere else to go with them. I'm making a fucking RTS. You're not going to play, the sequel to the 8th chapter in Consummate's history or something, and you walk in and like the main character is just in a fucking daycare somewhere. Like, that's not going to happen. So obviously, like unlike Life of a Marine, I intend to. You don't need to see the Marines back in the barracks. You need to see them on the front lines. So the same sort of aspect for the characters, in my opinion.
No.
So.
I think, approach is very methodical. Like, my goal is the same. Ultimately, it's character driven. Like Apex J, its original basis has the 3 characters. There's the Iron Emperor. There's you, the main character Anna, and then there's your primary opponent, which is the Star-Blooded Saint. And then he has an advisor that shows up sometimes in dialogue, but that's pretty much it. And your character doesn't say anything. So I go back onto that sort of established trope that the main character doesn't interact, but that's actually like a core driving part of the entire dialogue. Because the Iron Emperor basically creates a machine faction. And he's been fighting this other opponent in this feud for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, to the point he doesn't even remember how it even all started. Doesn't even remember how it's all started. But he's done basically every trick in the book, and the other guy's done every trick in the book. They've been deadlocked for years until now he's on the verge of defeat. But now he has this secret weapon that he's dredged up, this sort of like genetics of the gods. And he creates this artificial beast that can directly interface to control mechanisms and is now capable of doing things faster and more efficiently and, with greater accuracy and better intuition than basically, any kind of like AI system or any other person. And they're literally called the goddess of war. And then that is how now you justify why the player can do things that the AI can't, like think and adapt and stuff like that.
Okay.
But all throughout all this and through all these missions and stuff like that, you're still just like focused on the individual characters. And they are an emperor kind of like monologuing to you and trying to connect to you, but not really being able to. And behind all that, we do have the world that's been rebuilt from the scratch up to the point where I justify literally every single piece of history, every single unit you've come across, every single weapon you come across, every single mechanic, every single event. And one of the main reasons why I do that is because I like to have answers. So say, for example, when we start our map, we start our first map, and it's the first tutorial map, and you are up against a guy in sort of a bloodbath kind of arena. And you're going to get rushed by him. We're going to have that classical bunker rush that I used to weed out not gamers. And the whole idea, like the whole basis for this guy being here, all that has to be justified. It has to be justified why he's here and the main army is not, or the main dropping force is not. We have to justify why he breached these defenses, why other things aren't reacting to him, and why he's attacking in the way he does, and how he can do it. And then we got to weave that into the story. We have to have all these answers. We don't really approach a lot of this stuff within the writing. I had thought of making like a codex that explains a lot of this stuff on the side you can view once you've cleared the campaign. if I ever actually get to creating that, then maybe I'll do that. But it's like an aside thing that you would read on the side if you really wanted to, and I expect 99% of people aren't going to want to because it's going to be a lot of text.
Well, it's not important information for the player to know. It's more so that you can justify it internally, so that when you're writing the stuff, when you're writing the dialogue, when you're writing it, it will I think as long as you're writing it well, it'll naturally have a sense that these characters know what's happening. These characters know the reason for it. And so the player will sort of learn by immersion. They'll soak that up and understand there is a reason for all this shit happening. And there's even a reason for these units behaving the way that they do, and so on and so forth. So yeah, for sure, I can see the value in it, even if it's not public, or if it's just some relegated to some side stuff that people will read if they're, like you said, if they're interested.
It's all about having that internal consistency we talked about, not just in what we're demonstrating to the player, but to ourselves as developers, because we start asking a lot of questions when we start actually like designing stuff from the storytelling standpoint. Like when I make mods, or at least when I used to make mods, like Armageddon Onslaught and stuff like that, there wasn't any of that really at all. It was more like, okay, so what contributes to this playstyle? What fits this thematically? How can I make this fun to actually play around with? It wasn't really, like, there was underlying, like, technical, this is kind of how this works, this is kind of how that works, this is why this looks like that, but nothing really at the nitty-gritty, super low level where we start thinking about, like, the different kinds of metals and stuff we put together, like we do within Apex. Because we never needed those answers at all, because we don't approach these things from a storytelling standpoint. But when we get into the campaign, that I want to have this very intimate character-on-character thing, and the feuds between them, we have this sort of backdrop to them. We have that war drama thing that I mentioned, where we think about like the background of like World War II and Hitler. Well, why would Hitler attack Russia? Why did Hitler evade Russia? Was he just out of his mind? What kind of resources are we going on? Why does that lead to his defeat? So on and so forth. All these little tidbits between the lines we don't necessarily read into from the narrative, but when we're designing it, we need things to make sense in case we ask ourselves questions. So why did the character decide to do this? Like when we look at Raynor is basically bipolar. Nothing he does or says or make any sense at all. We're at the point within Wings of Liberty where his crew's, thinking of mutinying against him. People are pushing him around. His shit's ragtag. He's got this highly advanced battlecruiser that's on the verge of breaking down because they can't repair it. But we're still actively running missions. We're still actively harvesting all these resources. We are still uncontested, going from planet to planet to planet, having to pick and the choose of what it is we want to do and when we want to do it. And since we just build minerals and build barracks and equip Marines and keep our ground operations going, what stops us from servicing the battlecruiser? What stops us from paying our crew? So on and so forth. Like, we ask all these really basic questions, which everybody's always going to ask when they start asking about motives. Why doesn't Raynor stop and pick up some minerals from a stray moon or something if he's running this short on fumes instead of burning it all fighting against stray Zerg and stuff like that? Just save some stuff on the side, spend a couple extra minutes mining from the planet's surface, so on, so forth. So we have to answer all that. We have to look at all that because we want things to make sense superficially. And in order for things to make sense superficially, they have to make sense at all levels. Because if we scrutinize something for a second and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, we're going to start questioning things more and more and more and more as we go along. I do a lot of this during my LPs. I pick apart the motives and stuff of writing, and what we end up finding a lot is that there's just a lot of convenient excuses and plot devices and people knowing stuff they really shouldn't actually know, or that's never explained how they know it, doesn't make sense and breaks consistency and so on and so forth. The nutshell of it is that game writing is absolutely horrendous. The games industry just doesn't have writers. But neither does the movie industry. I just watched a new Godzilla movie that came out, Godzilla King of the Monsters. And I don't think Godzilla was ever necessarily home to really fantastic writing, but this film has got to have some of the worst writing I have ever been exposed to in a really long time, and horrendous choreography. It was so fucking bad. It was obviously through money at the CGI, but the CGI doesn't even come within pissing distance of Pacific Rim, and the writing is so bad for what amounts to effectively the same thing as Pacific Rim. I couldn't believe that I was watching a film that someone had put together, a multi-million, maybe even multi-billion-dollar film that was just so badly executed. So much fucking plot devices and shit. But every single game is like that. Every single games like that. So we want, like, the main reason why I like to build stuff from the ground up is because I feel more confident about stuff feeling more natural. If I don't have a solid foothold in the setting and I know precisely the answer to everything, it becomes harder and harder and harder for me to justify what the characters do. Like, if you came up to me and you said, make a Protoss campaign, I would be like, so which arc of the Protoss are we using? If you said, make me a Zerg campaign, I would say, okay, so are we considering Xeris filled with primordial Zerg where they got all the strains from, like in Heat of the Swarm? Or are we following original canon where they took this strains from other planets? Like, there's so many like inconsistencies that before you even get started in making a story on StarCraft, you have to ask, what version of Blizzard's fanfic are we actually using? Because Blizzard just writes fanfic. It's just Warhammer fanfic. And because it's not consistent, it becomes hard for me to make decisions about it. Like, do we consider that the Overmind's a good guy, or is he a villain? Do we have prophetic fucking Nerid Tassadar and his tentacles? Like, we gotta ask so many different questions, none of which actually make any sense even on their own, because they're just too stupid. But we have to ask those questions before we even get into motivations. Like, why would the Zerg go here? Why do they go there? Cerebrats, Dark Templar, UED or whatever, like, it just becomes too much of a headache because so much of it is just so disassociated with each other. Because it's just so disassociated with each other, and there's no like connections between the world. There's no like characters driving the world. It's just basically a bunch of hodgepodge excuses to make micro maps and gimmicks out of, rather than actually having something that compels people to make decisions. Then from the very get-go, any questions we ask are just met with blank stares. And that's it. So I spent a very, very long time, a methodical amount of time. Apex has been in development for over 10 years now. Building, rebuilding until what I feel really confident and safe about. Because when I feel really confident and in my safe space, then I can just piss out characters, I can piss out settings, I can piss out anything. The D&D campaign I'm running is based on the Apex world, but it's based on like an alternative ending for the main story. We've gone from when it's like a good ending, we've spun that around and said, this is the worst possible ending. And now you could ask me, how is it the worst possible ending? What exactly goes wrong? And I can say, well, everything goes wrong. Things we haven't even imagined could go wrong, we can now just conjure on the spot, because that's something I can do. You want me to make a character, you want me to make a race, you want me to make a vehicle, you want me to make an event. I can just conjure that on the spot. I have no problems designing stuff from the ground up in such a setting I'm comfortable with. But to get comfortable, to be able to do that, it takes me a long time. So I can't do that. I can't be a fanboy. I can't make a fanfic. I can't make anything based on another person's world because I'm not comfortable with it, even if it's something that at least on surface makes sense. Like Warhammer 40k, it's got some weird stuff, but superficially it makes sense. I couldn't make a campaign based in it. Not a chance in hell. But, for a lot of the campaigns that I've seen that are not from Relic, or a lot of the stories I've seen that are not from Relic, they make sense. They can make sense contextually because I understand the core philosophies of the world. A lot of my questions get answered by those core philosophies. Then I don't have to ask questions. Then I can focus on the meat of the content, which is precisely where Relic stuff falls apart because they break away from that at every chance.
Well, I think it's... Oh, am I still broadcasting? Oh, okay. Cool. OBS just broke, that's all. Anyway, we're still recording. It's just the fucking plugin is busted. Oh, I think it's working now. No? Okay. Well, whatever. It doesn't matter. Bottom line is, as long as you can still hear me, we can still keep talking. So, I 100% agree with the idea that there's so many issues with the way that Blizzard writes, and they lack those core sort of philosophies of the way that their worlds are put together, or not in many cases, which is obviously like something that you see a little bit less in some of what Relic does, but like you said, that when you actually dig into the meat of it is where shit just breaks. But I think it's funny that, like I was referencing earlier, that I'm taking a bit of a more minimalist approach to restructuring and recontextualizing the environment and the universe with my stuff, where I'm just trying to like have characters that are the driving force. Like, that's my focus. Blizzard sort of took a minimalist approach to designing anything in their universes and had no focus. So it's sort of like the worst of both worlds, where you're not really being technical.
We're just gonna not hire anybody who's ever actually even read anything before or tried to read anything before.
Like that, I mean, these are some of the only fucking things you can, like, the only conclusions you can draw from experiencing their writing. So I don't know, man. It was definitely weird to me to go through, like, even some of their older stuff. Like, recently I played Warcraft 1, and that game doesn't really have writing at all. Like, it doesn't really have anything. It's literally just like some guy monologuing to you. And even the way that it's written, like, at first it's like, you know, the war chief has new orders for you, blah blah blah, do this, do that, and it's all voiced. Every single thing in that game is voiced by Bill Roper, so that's great. But then you get into some really sick territory where, like, 5 missions in, the guy's, instead of Bill Roper telling you what the war chief wants, he's narrating your actions. Like, a messenger arrives to bring you news, and you say this to him, or something. Like, there's a complete tense change. Like, they're not even, like, writing in the same, like, from the same perspective. It's like gone from third person to, like, or third person general or something, like, to third person, like, personal. And I don't know, it's just really weird. Like, that caught me so off guard when that happened. It's just immediately distracts you. It's like, obviously, I guess you and I pay more attention to some of the stuff than most people who play. And of course, that's a really old game, so people had no fucking standards back then, even less than they do now, somehow, one would say. At least when it comes to the shit that Blizzard was popping out. But yet, somehow, it was still wound up being a better experience than fucking Warcraft 3. Which I've been watching some of the last stuff that I didn't end up finishing your series way back when it was actually launched, and man, the writing, comparing the writing is some serious shit. So it was interesting to me that we had fucking just played Warcraft 1 and, like, they still didn't even know how to write back then. I guess it just confirms suspicions, but at the very least, it wasn't like a focal point. There wasn't really a focal point in Warcraft 1. There was pretty much nothing there, but at least they weren't trying to, like, shove their story down your throat and interrupt gameplay all the time like in Warcraft 3. So I'll give it that anyway.
I think Warcraft 3's biggest mistake was the fact that Metzen got more power. Because it seems like the more power Metzen got, the worse things got until now, where even though Metzen got kicked out, everything is just so far gone it can't be recovered.
Right. So, to circle us back a little bit, I have prepared a link that will take you, hopefully, unless the wiki.dot breaks, to the page where this is technical information concerning the like the gameplay side implementation of some of the things that are going to turn it a little bit more towards MOBA for the one player that's being micro in the example that I was giving earlier. This is the relics section of the Hydra new game state document. Now, these are planned to also appear in macro. Like, in the main campaign, you'll be playing macro, and as Protoss, you'll be able to field a hero of your choosing from whatever is available in that given moment. And in Melee, all of them will be available. But of course, only one at a time per match. So, for example, if there were 8 Protoss players playing an FFA, there'd be at least 8 heroes to choose from. And if one of them started to make one, then that would become precluded for everybody, as an example. So we'll just use Melee as an example because it's a little bit easier to contextualize. In a Melee match of this sort, you would have AI and human players alike taking from this shared pool of not only the heroes, but also the relics themselves. So only one relic of each kind can exist because it's meant to be, like, you know, a unique thing. So there's a minimum of 8 weapons, 8 armors, and 16 augments, since each hero can have 2 augments, 1 armor, and 1 weapon. And the idea is that I'm basically making a sort of item system similar to what you would find in something like League. And I'm not sure about the specifics. Obviously, I've got to test all of these out. But in theory, this seems like a fine way to have a player spend money to augment their hero and get a decent reward for it. Like, it's gating it in such that it's not, like, broken and overpowered because it's easy to access, but it's not useless at the end of the day compared to just pooling all of that money into upgrading your main army or building more units. That was the main thing. And maybe it's like oil and water and they just don't mix. Maybe heroes that require a lot of micro attention in a context where I'm raising the supply cap and making resources never run out and doing all these other things that are going to make the game more macro focused, slanted in that area. Maybe this will just not work out. It is an experiment, and that sort of feeds back into the idea that I was talking about earlier where it's a tech demo. But I'm interested in seeing your take, if anything here jumps out at you as far as, like, just the concept of relics in general, or anything sort of like that that you're seeing in what I linked you, or anything that it makes you think about.
I'm just skimming it right now because it's kind of hard to review and talk at the same time.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's more as like an icebreaker for like a jumping off point for another kind of topic, since we're veering back into the more like gameplay oriented aspects after talking about story.
So, Heroes and RTS gameplay, I've always considered just impossible to do properly, which is why whenever I thought about having Heroes, it would take me back to doing like those hybrid maps where you had AI allies running your heroes and stuff like that. But in the mods I had Heroes, typically they were tied to upgrades for their specific structures. There was actually one race in the Warcraft 3 mod which was only heroes, and they made up for it by having strong heroes, so you could just play a race that only had heroes and build structures. You still had to expand and stuff like that, but you were very focused on your heroes, and you're up against other races that had heroes and units. But normally I looked at heroes as like the level up growth was very low, but their actual strength could be very high, but it was based on your technological growth. So that meant researching and still playing the RTS to make your RPG elements effective, which is kind of what this comes to me. Although a lot of these upgrades seem pretty cheap for how much they actually can give you. Say, for example, the one that lets you revive enemies you have killed. That is similar to some of the Armageddon abilities, like the boss abilities that they would have. And when you go into certain abilities like that, they can be extremely powerful in certain circumstances, even in general certain circumstances. I think that you're going to have a lot of challenge in balancing the numbers for this.
For sure.
Because once people figure out certain things, because especially when you're up against an AI opponent, you have to be really careful about what kind of power budget you give to things like heroes, because the AI just can't do intelligent things with them. It's going to do the dumbest shit with them, and the players are going to sit on a choke point and they're going to revive 500 units, and that's going to be it. So you got to be you got to be really mindful of stuff like that, because it is most certainly going to happen no matter how careful you are about it. But
well, keep in mind, as far as the cost goes, you also have to pay for fielding the hero in the first place. You don't get the hero at start, and the structure that is required for this requires either a cyber core or a citadel of Adun, so it's like a tier 2 structure, and it itself will require gas and minerals. So the idea is that it's a heavy investment of multiple phases to get a hero in the first place, and then also to augment them, because all relics need to be made from the same structure. You can only make one of those structures, and each one is a minute, so you're investing a minute, not like time gating as well will make it so that imagine all the other things you could do in that time, or all the other things you could do with those resources to get units instead. So you're right that obviously it'll require a lot of balancing on the like the number crunching side, but as a concept, the idea is to provide like an alternative to producing a lot of units, because that's what you're going to be doing instead of producing a lot of units, is you're going to be doing this. At least for the early game, or some form of the game in general.
I thought about heroes a lot for Apex in the earlier renditions, I thought, because at the time for those earlier renditions, you were playing as basically the most powerful character in that world. And in the writing, he is independently controlling stuff through an AI that's a symbiote for him. And he takes to the field. But I thought, so what do I do with the player? Do I give the player access to this unit? Because this guy's going to be insanely strong. And if I don't make him insanely strong, it's not going to make any sense for the context. So I thought about it for a long time. And I thought, well, in an ideal situation, the hero is actually AI controlled for a lot of these cases. And then the AI is smart enough to prioritize either things you've set out for it, or attack and retreat on its own regard. Which at the time I had believed you could graft, again, if it was possible to pull stuff out of Heroes of the Storm, you could graft some of the functionality they have for the bots and that, the beacon based stuff, which I think actually it's really just attack wave manipulation when I think about it. But not really being experienced with Galaxy, I didn't really know enough to really make a conceptual thing myself. So eventually I just decided we just wouldn't have player control heroes at all.
Right.
But in concepts I had thought about you having heroes, it would be something where there is no leveling at all. You don't, like, experience just doesn't exist. All of your strength is determined through research. So this is definitely a step in that direction, which is good. The
more to the point version of what you were describing, a more like vanilla version of this is the Terran heroes. The only real special, like they get upgrades, and that gives them their abilities. Like they don't have like actual abilities, skills to use that cost energy or anything like that. That you have to research those. There's also functionality of those abilities that can then be upgraded after, so you can sink a lot of resources into them. The other thing is that you can also deploy a new form for them. So like Raynor has his Marine, Vulture, and Battlecruiser form. You can first get Raynor Marine for cheaper and Vulture Marine for relatively cheap as well. But if you want Battlecruiser Raynor, like that's going to cost you a lot more. It's going to take a lot more time, and then you can bring your active hero to the structure that was producing that, load them in there, and then change their forms free of charge at that point, anytime, once you have all the forms unlocked. So that's like a little bit of a different step. It's a little bit of a different abstraction. My idea was to try to make every race's version of heroes operate on a different level, but still have a common denominator of spending money in order to specialize them or improve them, and tying a lot of their power budget to time and resources, so that they would actually still be engaged with via the RTS mechanics that you would expect to be using, especially in a melee, but also in an RTS campaign in an ideal world.
Yeah, I faced sort of a similar challenge with my Age of Wonders 2 project, which is a turn-based sort of like Heroes of Might and Magic. Because there's heroes in there. I had different tiers of heroes, but you're randomly given a hero when the game starts, so you can just be handed one of the legendary heroes right off the bat.
Oh, okay.
But it's also because you can't really customize abilities in that game, and you can build items and stuff with that. So though, like in the vanilla game, basically you can make stuff impossible to be hit, just by stacking buffs and stuff. So it was regardless of like heroes or not. But heroes were very like inconsequential. The main thing that heroes offered was domain for you to be able to cast spells and stuff through your wizard normally in areas you don't normally have your domain, and some other stuff like that. But depending on your luck and on your race and on your items, you can get things that basically provide on-hit stuns or freezes and stuff like that. So, but what I really liked about that game was that you could actually forge your own items. So normally within like at least Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and 5, the items you find are randomly generated on the map, or you get them from buildings or something like that. You can't make them. And some of those items are pretty strong, like the ones that will give you access to all the spells, or ones that will increase damage of spells, or increase your luck, or stuff like that. And those can be very, very game-changing, but your heroes are much more non-combat. They represent your army. They can attack or do whatever on their turn, but most often they're just basically the stat stick that holds the army together. The army is doing the majority of the fighting. They can't be attacked. So Age of Wonders 2 is very different because heroes are basically just units. You can have stacks without heroes. Heroes basically are just there.
Right.
But my project, I wanted heroes to be more... Yeah, I wanted heroes to be more powerful and mean more within that. Which meant that I had some heroes that were strong and decent, and then some heroes that were incredibly strong and really, really, really good. To the point of, like, they were basically, like the game normally goes up to, I think, tier 3, and my mod went up to tier 10 for some of the races. Unfortunately, due to limitations, I couldn't give heroes any more than 50 health, whereas units could go up to 128 or something like that, 127, with the use of an external editor, so they were always on the back foot, and I couldn't rebalance the numbers for evasion and stuff like that, so that was always a problem. But what I ended up deducing with the heroes is that having the heroes' numbers, like their actual like physical numbers, their attack damage and stuff like that, on the same as the regular units, was very, very good. What I wanted to give the heroes to make them more power was flexibility and utility. So I wanted to make them a little bit more defense conscious. A lot of them, basically, if they're in their higher tiers, they just automatically come with resistance versus damage. So their 50 health doesn't completely screw them. But having more utility, like access to the abilities, access to stuns and stuff, that you normally couldn't get within this project at all, meant that they were a lot more valuable as utility. So, yes, early on, if you started with a very strong hero, you could clear creep camps and stuff like that way easier than if you started with something, for example, something that wasn't converted and was just a default hero, because some of those were still in the game. I mean, the game had like 15, 16 races in it. I didn't convert everything by the end. But at the same time, when we had like a big army, like 20 versus 20 units or something like that, and both armies had really strong heroes, the interaction was really interesting, at least from a turn-based perspective, because it really came about not just simply babysitting your heroes, because if they died, they basically just died. That was it. And you could lose a lot of investment. But also really like protecting them, but also taking advantage of their utility, which is a lot easier in a turn-based setup than a real-time strategy, where basically if you were using the same kind of stat system, all you'd really need is just 8 Marines to kill a hero, since that's really all you need to like kill a battlecruiser in a lot of cases if they're upgraded. But like the utility and stuff like that could be expressed in way different ways in the system where you actually have some flexibility. So I've noticed in here you've got like aura effects, and I think that's like a good place to start, because auras and stuff like that really don't exist in StarCraft normally, and they shouldn't. Because they're too strong. But that's something that sets a hero apart. And that's something that gives a hero a lot of value, is having auras and things like cloaking fields and stuff like that, support abilities and utility abilities that improve or manipulate other units without directly like nuking them. Like the main thing I always try to avoid with stuff like super units, because super units, like if you think back to like Supreme Commander, the super units like the Monkey Lord and stuff like that, and they're basically defined by a veterancy that gives them in huge chunks of health and regeneration and stuff like that, but also the fact that they're basically just going to one-shot most of the units in the game. Depending on the super unit, some work differently, but the vast majority of them, they fire weapons, that's it. Everything dies instantly. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, there's no difference between that and like just a literal superpowered, like overpowered unit. Like there's no difference in how you express your skill in that sense. It's just like a better unit.
So in Apex, the Terran equivalent, and the Iron Fleet and stuff like that, they can build ships, and you can build all the way up to battle moons. And the idea is that you build these larger and larger and larger and more expensive things until you're paying upwards of like 10,000 minerals for a unit. What you get out of it is a lot of direct firepower, but generally more weapon systems. So more things that can, for example, attack enemy projectiles. Not with the same efficiency of a defense drone that can gun down everything around it so long as it's got mana, but more point defense in that they can fight other stuff at once and provide support. So they become, like when you have a big blanket of these things, they become very, very defensively conscious. You need a lot to actually defeat these defenses, which makes sense. If you have a carrier battle group in modern times with destroyers and cruisers and carriers, they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. They all serve a purpose in their group. They're all equally strong. The largest ships, being the carriers, have a very specific purpose that they're very good at, which is, fielding, strike craft, and operations like that. And then destroyers and stuff like that are things like point defense and precision and things like that. So it makes sense when we look at our large units, if you build a 10,000 mineral carrier or battleship or something like that, that it has options like long-range bombardment, strike craft, and stuff like that. But it doesn't necessarily serve a super overwhelming power in itself. And that's what I thought more or less of heroes. So when I thought more of heroes, I thought more of them as like less like they get strong offensively. Like they can, some of them can CC, some of them have auras, some of them attack fast, some of them are assassins. But offensively speaking, their power budget shouldn't be so overlapped that you look at like Raynor Marine with Stimpack just basically gunning down everything on a ramp in seconds. Endlessly, because he's on a ramp. I look at the way of managing the power budget more to their sustain and their utility, because within my projects, I tend to move away from having on-click abilities. Like in StarCraft 2, you have feedback and you have snipe. In those, the interaction of the units with those is horrible. It's basically just units just one-shotting each other based on who clicks or who gets in range fast enough. It's bad. It's terrible. You have fungal growth, which is just click, and now everybody's CC'd and taking damage. Stupid as fuck. I like to have more conditional and more natural and more like free-flowing interactions with things. So I move away from anything that's just point and click and something happens to a unit. Like, fucking what's his name? Anchor Man from League of Legends. He clicks his ult, you're going to get hit by a depth charge. Yeah. And it's dumb because you can't actually get away from it. Like once you're in range and once it's chasing you, you're just going to get hit by it unless you have something that makes you invulnerable.
Yeah, well, Zanya's or whatever the fuck will still freeze you anyway. Yeah. So there's pretty much no way to do it outside of
or Vagar's ult. Like that's another one. Like point and click, you're just like if you have AP, you're just fucking dead. Like it's so fucking dumb. You go in range of this guy, you're just dead. Unless you built like pure tank and completely defeated the entire point of your class to begin with. Like it's dumb. It's dumb. It's not fun to play as, and it's not fun to play against. So like when we look at the RTS especially, we want to avoid stuff like that because it also breaks the flow of how you actually play an RTS. You don't want you just clicking on the unit and just clicking on stuff.
Yeah,
like if we want direct damage, we look at like Psionic Storm, right? Like something that in order to really maximize the effectiveness of Psionic Storm, you need the enemy to stand in it for its full duration, which has to have to be like a variety of consequences for that to happen. Your Templar need to be in the right place, they need to be not paying attention, or you need to have surrounded them, so on and so forth. So it's like the bare like minimum to having a direct damage ability.
Oh, you might like what I did with all the vanilla spells in that case, because I pretty much reworked all of them in some form or another. Because they're a lot of, even in Brood War, like as good as they are compared to everything else, they still do front load a lot of that shit with like either a really fast moving projectile or just immediate effect on in a certain area. And the Psystorm's okay because you can't avoid it, but especially with Zerg, it's like you have to have really good reaction time, which obviously the pros do.
They're really squishy.
Yeah, you know, Zerglings will just die in 2 or 3 ticks, I think. 3 ticks, I think. So yeah.
So, like, a lot of your stuff here seems pretty good in that regards. There's not, like, a lot of, I get Yamato Gun, I get a instant nuke something.
Exactly.
So,
well, even Yamato Gun itself, like, it's still point and click at the base Yamato Gun, but it requires a much longer charge-up time. It went from 3 seconds to 5 seconds of charge-up time. It gained increased range, so you can use it more as, like, a way to bust open a certain area, which is, like, the idea for the unit. I thought if you're going to use that instead of engaging in direct combat, like, that should be a more positional ability. Now you lock up the battlecruiser for longer, they can get CC'd or they can get destroyed in the time. So it's a little bit more counterplay. It's not directly because it's not a projectile that can miss, but it's a bit more situationally dependent in that sense, which I like because it also negates a turtling to some effect.
Yeah, there's a lot of siege weapons in my project concept. There's a lot of strong defenses as well. There's artillery, Supreme Commander styled artillery that have a force fire at higher inaccuracy over a really long distance. So if you get this build space to build these huge artillery installations, you can just nuke stuff across the map with them. So there's a lot of like sort of things like that where you look at more or less like the siege kind of gameplay, which I thought was interesting from Supreme Commander. It was one of those things that really wasn't explored a lot, along with the shield generators and stuff like that. So, but those are much more difficult to do in StarCraft 2. I don't know if I'll be able to do those. I can probably do hive, nanite hives and repairing though. So that might be one way to mitigate getting poked by that. But yeah, I try to look like with heroes. Like I think that the like heroes as they are within most of these games, where they're basically just like a do or die stat stick. That's not good. But turning them into something that's just got like a bunch of cooldowns you rotate, that's bad too. So trying to
it's like that requires way too much focus when you're trying to also do RTS stuff.
And it's either too strong or too weak. Like there really is no in between with active abilities. So I try to like look away from that. Like I don't even think. I think like the Commando has a timed mine, and that's the only unit all the way up until like tier 4 or 5 with a tactical jump on the Dynex cruiser that you actually see any buttons you click on in all of Apex that I can think of right now. There's if you play as Iron, you get Ravens and a lot of stuff like that, but those are like high tech stuff. So
yeah, and yet it's not like
we were talking.
Like you eschewed a lot of the actual active abilities, but it's not like you removed micro from the game by doing so. Nope. And something I always come back to when I think about shit like this is the guy from Planetary Annihilation's embarrassment of a fucking development team saying that they removed as many, like they completely eschewed active abilities because they wanted to remove micro from the game, as if that would fucking accomplish it. Like they're trying to remove precise micro or whatever. I mean, similar to like Subcon 2 where people were getting upset because you were microing your hero or your leader or whatever it's called. It's just like a fucking shit show. Like, as if that's something you should aspire to do in the first place, but also as if what you're doing could actually accomplish that alone. Like, if that's something, if that's all you needed to remove micro from your game was way too dependent on that in the first place. You know what I mean? It's like that's not where the driving micro should be. They didn't even
have those in the Supreme Commander 1 or 2. They didn't really have active abilities that I remember.
Yeah, I think he was contrasting it against stuff that Blizzard made because obviously those are the more popular RTS titles.
But all the stuff that Blizzard added removed micro. Like it's the funniest thing. Like it speaks to lengths of how these people don't understand the RTS genre at all. Right. Yeah, like I was focusing a lot on how units behave. Like the current concept for the battlecruiser replacement in the Corvette, it has 2 weapons, a really, really long railgun barrage, I think does like 70 something damage. And then 4 missiles that it just automatically fires while moving that it will hit ground and air. Its railgun barrage can hit anything on the ground, but can only hit medium or larger enemies. So I was using like armored and stuff to denote their size. So it can't hit like wraiths or like Viking equivalents, but it can hit like drop ships and Valkyries and stuff like that. So, but it burns all of its damage. It has a really, really long cooldown on this one ability, but it's very long range. It's very good for siege. And its missiles really depend on your positioning because they will split up to 4 different targets if there's 4 different targets in range. So if you really want to maximize the most amount of single target damage on these corvettes, you really have to be super positionally conscious about them. Yeah, if you have a group of them, if you're spamming them, they're really good for attacking things like the Leviathan replacement or the Devourers or stuff like that. The really heavy air units, because that's what they're basically for, or for attacking like siege tanks and stuff. But to really like maximize their missile damage so that they don't get wasted on like random buildings and overlords and stuff, you have to like kind of group them up and separate them and kind of like skirt around things to get those missiles to target stuff on the edge that's out of position, like stray Melisks or stuff like that the railgun barrage can't hit. So even though it's like a very early thing, it still like really promotes you to really pay attention where your units are and what they're doing. So there's a larger siege tank called the Medusa tank. It fires a way more damaging set of projectiles, but the damage is more spread out than the siege tank. It doesn't do as much base damage, but it hits a wider variety of area, and it still does full friendly fire. So this thing will actually murder all of your units if you're not careful while you're moving things around with it. But it's still like a very good heavy siege weapon. So again, you have to pay really close attention to what this thing is attacking and where it's attacking and where the enemy is moving and stuff like that. And all this stuff is really just based on how stuff behaves. We have 2 very simple things that are just derivatives of stuff in the game, but how they behave is changed a lot by in which way their power is expressed. As opposed to the battlecruiser doing consistent damage, the Corvette's much more bursty and then has a little bit of point defense that sort of covers some of its weaknesses. But the effectiveness of those greatly depends on how you control the unit. So now it's much less about you spamming Y for Yamato gun and then just letting stuff auto attack or whatever, or focus firing. It's much more about where you have stuff, where the enemy has stuff. That was really what I was dialing down on with unit behaviors, is how things behave and then how you as a player work around that to make the absolute most of them. If you look at the raw stats for the Corvette, it probably doubles over the battlecruiser in damage, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of unit health has actually dropped in the mod compared to everything else. So on paper, it looks really, really, really overpowered. But in the Zerg map, for example, the Zerg destroy it very, very, very easily, even though Hydras aren't as strong as they are in normal StarCraft 2, just because it can't target Melisks with his main guns. So if they're out in the open, they don't necessarily get hard countered because the missiles still do 20 damage a hit. A single Melisk is still going to die very, very quickly to one of these things. But, for the power budget comparison, the Zerg will just obliterate these things up front if you just leave them alone and you don't move them around. So
yeah, they can get picked apart really easily. I mean, it seems like a really interesting unit concept just on the basis of the fact that you automated something in a sense with the missiles automatically acquiring targets and firing while moving. But like you said, it still requires you to actually be mindful of your positioning, especially in fights against enemies that can't be hit by the main guns or enemies that, there's a lot of other shit mixed in there, like overlords or other non-combatant units or non-threatening units in that context.
So the whole design feeds off of itself. And I think that's kind of what you're going for with these heroes, just by what I'm reading. So I think that's a good start. Because a lot of your stuff is based on behaviors, or it works off of existing stuff. Because the thing about heroes is you don't want to have the player devoting half of their APM to the hero. Not just because, the hero is micro-intensive, but because if you devote half your APM to it and they get that much power budget out of it, it devalues the rest of the game. So you want the heroes to be valuable in the sense of how they complement the gameplay than how they replace it. The problem with all this shit, like Dawn of War and Toll Commander or Supreme Commander and stuff like that, is once you get these units, they're just retarded. Like Supreme Commander, Forged Alliance, the Seraphim Commander, a very, very popular cheese was to take the early researches for it, which gave you regeneration, and then to kill enemy units, which at low tiers is very, very easy for them to do because it's a very combat-centric commander. And eventually you just hit a point in regeneration where enemies can't actually damage you anymore. That's actually the most powerful thing about the Monkey Lord early on, is as it's killing enemies, and every single time it ranks up in veterancy, it gains a chunk of health, which means it's actually sustain tanking a ton of shit. I think the only way you can easily kill one of those things is with like tier 3 bombers or something like that. Before you hit like full actual tier 3. But if you rush these things in secret, you can actually get them very, very easily. So you could hit a point where you have an actual tech advantage with just one unit that if the enemy chooses to fight, they just make it stronger. So like there's a lot of really stupid shit with those units that aren't even necessarily heroes. It's just the nature by how their power budget scales. Because of veterancy and leveling up and stuff like that, they just become absurdly strong. You go back into Warcraft 3, leveling up turns into damage reduction. It turns into abilities. It increases the amount of direct damage a lot of heroes do just with their abilities. Like, for example, Chain Lightning or Stormbolt, or whatever, and then the ultimate abilities, which are just all broken, or stuff like that. And then it just becomes about, well, I have a level 10 Mountain King, and I got some luck with some of the items I drop. And now, unless you do something really specific, you're probably not going to kill this guy. He's just going to kill everything, because nothing can really do that much damage to him. It's going to take him a very long time to do it, because, it's Warcraft 3, but he will eventually kill a lot of stuff in the game. And, that's why I looked at all the experience of all the different games. Like, Sins of a Solar Empire has heroes as well. And, have you played Sins of a Solar Empire?
I have never played Sins of a Solar Empire, but I've seen
Sins of a
just a
Solar
little
Empire is, some people call it a 4 times, which stands for bad, terrible, untested, and gross.
That's my experience with 4X's, yeah.
It's very, very Kimoi. So in this Kimoi game, you can make heroes. It's just like Warcraft 3. You can make heroes. So in Sins of a Solar Empire, it has the it's about as advanced of an engine as Warcraft 1. It is very, very, very primitive. Much more primitive than Homeworld 1. There's no real 4 times elements to it either. And when it comes to fleet versus fleet battles in late game, it can actually take like 30, 40 minutes for anything to die. Wow. It's an absolute nightmare in a slideshow at that. Unless you get multiple hero ships that stack AoE damage, then you can start to kill stuff faster.
Yeah, like 20 minutes instead of 40, or how fast are we talking about?
Something like that. Yeah, because you're waiting on mana a lot of the time too. Or cooldowns. And it was, I remember it being an absolute fucking shit show. It was so stupid. And I mean, that's the case with Warcraft 3 as well. Like, take, for example, orcs. Now, say you've got 2 endgame teams of Warcraft 3, orcs versus undead or something like that. Where do you think the vast majority of actual raw damage is going to come from for the orcs? It's probably going to be the Farseer and the Tauren Chief Den, between Chain Lightning and Shockwave. That double AoE nuke is your primary way of dealing damage. The heroes outshine everything else by leaps and bounds for a variety of reasons, one of which they're doing damage that the vast majority of the game doesn't resist. They bypass all of the innate damage reduction everything else has through armor because of the way spell damage works. And 2, they can put that damage precisely where they want. Chain Lightning does sort of bounce around, but at high levels it's going to kind of bounce everywhere. There's not really a lot of units to bounce to. Suffice to say, you can point and click on what it is you want to do the most damage to anyways. So you can put all this damage where you want it to go. You can be confident it's going to do as much damage as it says it's going to do. So now you've outshined like everything else that you have access to in having the ability to put damage where you want and then just keep spamming it. Plus, it's AoE damage. So it's not just, I do 300 damage to this one grunt. I'm doing 300 damage to every grunt. So now the heroes, I mean, they're heroes. It kind of makes sense that they're supposed to be super strong. But now the game is exclusively about me throwing AoE down. Everything else, like the Turrens and the grunts and the headhunters and stuff, they just kind of sort of exist as just this fastest thing. If something disastrous happens where the enemy is Death Knight and Dreadlord are still alive and my heroes are dead and I've got half of an army and half health, I may as well just fucking run away, because now the rest of my stuff is useless. Because we're not going to kill these super powerful heroes that have this insane regeneration going on and all their own AoE abilities. That's the kind of thing you really want to avoid with heroes.
The other thing that morphs that matchup is that Blade Master will come out and you'll just be begging it to crit their Lich, and like it's just so ridiculous how much it morphs the fucking engagement, where you're either completely ignoring their army or you're only focusing on like 1 or 2 units and their heroes. Like you don't want that kind of fucking experience in any sort of I don't even know what the fuck you would classify Warcraft 3 as besides bad.
A shit show.
Yeah, like genre wise it's not an RTS clearly, and it's also not really an RPG.
Not an RTT.
So, yeah, I don't know, man.
Dawn of War is more of an RTT. By the way, Dawn of War also has heroes.
Dude, Dawn of War is another game that takes forever to resolve battles in. At least the first one, and the second one is an actual RTT. The first one is like I guess you're mining resources.
The
not
first
really mining,
one actually wasn't that bad of a game. When Winter Assault, I believe, first came out. When Winter Assault first came out, it wasn't actually too bad of a game. It was not a real RTS. It still had all the issues of being squad-based and stuff like that. But balance-wise, it wasn't too bad. Battles didn't take an eternity. But then Relic figured out how to design games, TM. And they added in hard caps. You can only build X of many units.
3.
Each unit, like 80% of the units in the game, where it's just slapped with hard caps. You can only build 1 of these. You only build 2 of those. You only build 3 of that. And then they put everything into hard counters. Like there was always some sort of counter system with that, but in a lot of cases you could just go around it. Like just spam plasma bolters. It's effective. Well, now you can't do that anymore because now everything is based on like 100% of multipliers versus certain things.
Hey, you can only have up to 4 plasma cutters anyway, so fuck you. Hard cap the weapon too.
Yep. Yeah, they hard cap everything. They hard cap all the units they threw in hard counters, and then suddenly the game was no longer a game anymore. Before, if you had infinite resources, you just build fucking thousands of Ogrins as infantry guard. Would it win you the game? No, but it was something you could do. It was like actually playing an RTS that wasn't even an RTS. Well, then they decided you can't do that anymore. Like, it's the most brain dead shit that they could have done, and of course, it's Relic, and they went and did it.
You should run Dawn of War 3. It's not a very long game, but it is very silly.
I remember Dawn of War 2's campaign was quite possibly the worst campaign for any, like, whatever isometric top-down game I have ever played.
Dawn of War 3 is not that bad, but it is really, like, it's flounderingly incompetent. I'll put it to you that way. Like, they tried to emulate StarCraft 2 and League of Legends, and I don't know what the fuck they got up, but it was a little silly, man.
See, at Dawn of War 2, a lot of the missions you could start where you could just walk over with your hero and just kill the enemy.
Yeah.
Because, like all the RTS maps were like that, because they started off to build their base, but all the maps are very small because squads can't handle maps. But because you've added some weapons to your hero and gotten some of those epic drops, you can just walk over to his base and kill him before he even gets a chance to even do anything. I ended most of the fucking game that way. It was horrible.
Yeah, no point were you actually threatened by anything. That was a weird
game. And then
game.
The revive mechanic. You only enter the mission with 4 units. Oh, and you can revive them too. So enemies aggro was terrible. You could just sit there trying to revive something over and over and over, and they get shot and die. I have some videos of that from way back. That game was a fucking embarrassment.
That was a good game.
that was. Game. I can't, like. What on earth would compel you to fund this company to give them your fucking franchise when they do this with it? And then they turn around and they made Space Marine.
Yeah, and after that, they opened up the IP to anybody. Anybody can make a Dawn of War.
They were like, please, somebody make a Warhammer game that isn't shit. Come on. Someone can do it. Somewhere.
I don't think anybody has yet.
I don't think so, too. I think I was looking at Warhammer stuff, and there was a Warhammer Diablo game, and I looked at a video briefly, and I saw epic purple items drop, and I closed the video.
Is that Inquisitor Martyr or whatever? I don't know.
Yes.
That one is like their launch trailer had like 30 FPS or something, or 20 FPS, I think it was. So how do you do that? Why? That's actually like more common than you would think too. Like like Blizzard with their fucking unit demos and the evolution maps or whatever having lag and fucking compression. Like how does that even happen? Like
what about their Diablo 3? Oh, you haven't even seen the ones. The Diablo 3 videos where they're like macro block to fuck in the actual game?
Is it just like the same like fucking it's just got to be the same shit as those battle reports for StarCraft 2, I imagine.
Oh, those battle reports have gone through a sharpening filter. They actually went out of their way to apply a sharpening filter.
Well, it looks more like Brood War if you put a sharpening filter on it. I guess. I don't know.
I guess that's the inverse of StarCraft Remastered, where they put a blur filter on them to try to make StarCraft 1 look bad.
Yeah, that's still sick.
And all their frame rates are off for everything in SCR. SCR is such a fucking clown world shit show. I still can't get over how displaced everything is and the ramps. Jesus Christ. People were paid for this shit. They didn't even do even the slightest modicum of their job, and they still got paid for it. Just
I've got a sleepy 30-year-old Canadian guy that does it way better than they do, so fuck them, I guess. Man. If a Canadian could do your job better, fire yourself, please.
Yeah, you gotta rethink your existence if a Canadian can do anything.
Just anything, anywhere.
Anything
besides wear blackface like your fucking president. Jesus Christ.
Only thing Canadians can do is wear brownface and suck cock, and that's it. Like, they can't actually do anything. I mean, just look at me.
Well, I guess that brings us towards the end here. Is there anything in particular you thought to close us up on? I know we've hit a broad spectrum of TISM and topics, but perhaps there's one thing or another that really spoke to you about this ep that you want to hammer home.
I still want to be able to make that fucking campaign for StarCraft 2, because this kind of shit, like, nobody in StarCraft 2 has ever even attempted to make an RTS before. There's just nobody who's even tried. And it's not just like the whole making an RTS thing, it's that there is nobody who's made respectable graphics. Yeah. Only Delphinium has tried to make particles, and his are kind of like a good learning experience, but they have so much potential that's not being realized. And there's just nobody trying to make really good content for StarCraft 2. And I know it's StarCraft 2 and the editor's a pile of shit. I mean, I've been there since beta, I know. But I think that the possibility to make a fairly decent build and destroy campaign is there, because I already have an AI that basically can do everything that Brood War does, except for expand. I mean, it can expand, but expanding is kind of fucky.
Right. So similar to Warcraft 3 then.
Yeah, you have features like the tactical AI, which is just entirely unexplored. Nobody's even tried to do this stuff. It's literally right in front of you, a working proof of concepts of how all this stuff works. Is just gonna like sit down and learn the data editor and set aside some time to actually put this stuff together. And it's certainly not something that's going to come soon, but it's still something I want to do. And I hope that I can really get to that at some point. And it really depends on a lot of factors, like real life not turning into an absolute more of a shit show than it is.
Right.
But it's still something I want to be able to get into do, because I think that having like functional stuff to go alongside along these discussions, at least like videos of them, because it's not something I would release to the public, would really go a long way to really I can talk about this shit all day. I can talk about the world building and stuff all day. Actions always speak super loud, right. Much louder than words. And just to have like a playable proof of concept, like I still want to make like that map crap thing, but I'm going to use the mod framework for it as opposed to doing it what I was going to do originally, because I could spend weeks trying to build something out of bullies, or I could just use some bullies and use a system that I know already works,
right? And
have a way better experience for us. So there's a lot of things like they're just going around and everything's sort of kind of like all over the place, but it's still something I want to do and I know I can do. The data editor kind of scares me because of how slow it is, but I have a much more powerful system now than I did last time. It should be maybe a little bit faster on my Ryzen 7 as opposed to my i7-920. So I have tested the maps. I can get about 30-40 FPS in some of them now. So I can actually play my own project, you know?
Yeah.
So and there's some things like when I dabbled a little bit in Warcraft 3, and I don't know why the game was crashing, but that put an end to that very quickly. But it kind of got me thinking about some of the AI and some of the stuff I want to try with the AI, like using straight up build orders inside the galaxy as opposed to using stock and stuff like that. So it's definitely something I want to get into. So Just browsing your page here, I think that you're off to a good start conceptually. Of course, actually playing it will really put stuff to the test. But I think you've got a good direction going on where you're sort of avoiding, like, we take this relic, so now we gain some new active abilities and stuff like that. So I think you've already sort of like realized the actual direction you want to go. But implementing heroes properly in an RTS is definitely something that is entirely unexplored. Nobody has ever tried to do this properly yet. So there's definitely going to be some growing pains associated with it. I think you're going to find that you're probably going to want to increase a lot of costs or have them tiered in upgrades or stuff like that. Because what you're probably going to find is, depending on the players, is they're either going to ignore them entirely because they're like too expensive initially up front and until like you get them later and then they're not as relevant or whatever. They're going to shun them, or they're going to be too strong up front or something like that. So it really depends on how you like structure your maps and stuff like that. But
right. Well, the motivation for including it in the first place was the realization that no matter how shitty a hero is, there's going to be some people who want to use that hero. And obviously, coming from experience of not only playing my own stuff, but everybody else's stuff where hero death is defeat, I realized pretty quick that that wasn't going to cut it in a more macro-based production where like you're going to be hiding him in your mineral line even more than you already were, basically. If you're not going to engage with the hero because that's what you're predisposed to do, you're probably just going to ignore it completely. And at that point, I was like, well, just make him opt in. So now you've got to build a structure that specifically handles hero stuff, and it's otherwise serves no purpose. The only purpose it does is to produce and upgrade heroes or produce these relics or whatever the case may be. Then you produce their heroes from there, then you upgrade them from there to increase their power budget, and this is all like steps that you can at any point opt out in. You build the structure. Oh, well, actually, this development in the match means I want to at least delay, if not completely eschew, the usage of heroes for this particular map because of something that happened early on. I see an opening here, or I got to change my build order here, or my expansion got fucking destroyed, or whatever. So then you can stray away from that. You produce the hero. Well, maybe you're using him for an early rush, and then you're not going to bother scaling him up at that point, or maybe he dies and you don't feel like buying a new one or something like that. So any sort of situations could result in something like that. And the idea was to give the player the freedom of choice without making the choices, obviously, like they have to be balanced, but in addition to that, without making it feel like such a fucking slog to actually try to make these heroes useful. So at once they're not overpowered or underpowered, they're balanced properly for this environment, and they don't feel like abstractions on an RTS, which is my initial worry. That's my main worry, is that no matter what I do, they're always going to feel alien and foreign, and maybe that will happen, but at least I'll know that like I tried my fucking hardest to try to make them work, and it didn't really fit the bill. Maybe I'll have some new ideas to go back on and explore later on for whatever my next implementation of that would be, or maybe I'll just decide the concept isn't worth exploring any further. But either way, I'll have more information than when I started, which is the whole goal of including it. And at the end of the day, if it does wind up being kind of a failure, or most players don't find any value in it, they can just choose not to engage in it, and there's still a whole game ready for them to engage with all of the other changes to the tech trees. So I think at the end of the day,
that's
it's sort
why
of
I
like
add a lot of tiers,
right? Yeah,
in Apex, it's player choice.
So yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's almost like I'm half in, half out in a sense, where I'm already predicting that maybe it's not going to go as swimmingly as I would hope. And I'm building in an escape vector where, okay, well, you can just say, don't build the heroes then, and then it's fine. But I also want to give the option for people who like to use heroes in an RTS context to still be playing an RTS, still be tested and expected to play well in an RTS environment, but to be able to spend their money on a more like front-loaded unit. And combining with the fact with I'm lowering the individual significance of all of the other units that were previously way higher in individual significance and increasing the supply count. That means that suddenly you're going to be seeing a lot of units if people eschew heroes, less units if people try to include them, and even less if they try to rush them, depending on the playstyle. So there's another area to judge individual playstyles based on that as well, which I think will be interesting if we end up getting any number of people like replays to look at or games or anything like that, which of course fixing replays is its own fucking thing because good luck. But outside of that, it would be interesting to see stuff like that, I think, play out. And like I said, if I'll have more information at the end of the day anyway, at the very least.
Yeah, well, it's something that bears experimentation, and it'll be a learning process in any shape or fashion. Like a lot of Apex's stuff is really like untested. Like the concepts all make sense and stuff, but we need to have the AI playing on these large maps with these high tier units to really test them at their absolute extent. I have a lot of experience to go upon from my previous projects, but it's untested in the contents of StarCraft 2, but when I look at it from the concept level, it says, well, a lot of my decisions about adding things like tiers and like super expensive units is maybe players want to play more defensively and take map control and support their AI ally over trying to rush things or whatever. So there's choices without really overlapping on a lot of stuff. So when you're walking into something like StarCraft and there really hasn't been a real RTS since StarCraft. And you ask questions, well, how can I explore from StarCraft? Things that everybody else has done wrong, at least give you an idea of, okay, this was wrong, like the Heroes in Warcraft 3. But why was it wrong, and can you make it right? So I think it's worth like actually looking into and testing. And if it doesn't work out, then you learn something from it, and maybe you can turn it into something better later on. So, the only thing you lose by trying it is maybe some time, but you have a lot to gain even if it doesn't work. Right. Meanwhile, if you don't try it, then you gain nothing for it. So, like Warcraft 3, I was trying hero-based stuff, and it didn't work out for a variety of reasons. But along the way, I learned a lot of different things about it that I applied to my projects for years and years afterwards, all the way into D&D. A lot of my D&D stuff is based on things I learned in Age of Wonders 2 and Warcraft 3. A lot of the way I handled numbers comes from those games, and as a result, I basically threw out everything, all the player handbook, the dungeon master guide, everything. I threw out all the stock stuff after I figured out, the basics of how the game works. And I've been building stuff with all of my numbers from scratch, and I've had so much more success than relying on vanilla stuff and basing things off of that, because of the experiences that things like screwing around with heroes and stuff in Warcraft 3 taught me. So there's always something to gain from trying new stuff.
Hell yeah. And as a sort of a parting shot, I do remember back when I had released the 2017 version of Inconsummate, you and I had some exchange where I mentioned that like I was taking some pride in producing the best custom campaign for StarCraft. Well, I think after playing all of the other campaigns that I've played so far, I can attest to the fact that that was a fucking pointless statement, because you literally try for a week and you do that. So yeah. I just wanted to recontextualize that a little bit. Something I remembered while we were talking about this is, and I think we'll probably end up doing a little bit more content. Like maybe the next podcast we can explore some of the other more like less hero focused, but still ingrained in RTS engagement and that sort of thing from a level design perspective, and maybe explore the living world a little bit more. Like there's a lot of stuff that we brushed upon, but
I have a lot of example maps and screenshots I can bring up and talk about from Apex. So I can talk about the evolution of why I reached the decisions I did. So
yeah, there's plenty of topics to trundle through for another podcast somewhere down the line, but for sure, I thought this was a great one. I think we definitely were able to hash out some ideas and explore some concepts that aren't really talked about, because very few people talk about making an RTS to begin with, and even fewer still talk about including heroes in that mix and trying to do a serious crack at it where it is going to be a different than just including a super unit or leveling up and getting invisible stats like in Warcraft 3 or something like that. So for sure, I think it was a good one, and thanks for joining me for it.
Yep, smoke weed.
Smoke
every
weed.
day.